If right now you Google the words the Marilyn Monroe of India, the search results would be the profile of the Indian actress Madhubala. Madhubala, being the Marilyn Monroe of Indian cinema, is such a popular reference that if you are a fan of Madhubala and her work, you would know this reference. During the 1940s and 1950s, Madhubala was widely considered to be the most beautiful actress of Hindi films. Some phrases used to describe her in the press included the Marilyn Monroe of Indian cinema, the Venus of Indian cinema, and some even refer to her as a living Taj Mahal. When I first heard the term the Marilyn Monroe of India, I was not a fan of it. On some level, I considered it reductive of Madhubala's legacy. I came across a blog online that was entitled "Why It's Unfair to Call Madhubala the Marilyn Monroe of India," and the writer set out that we have always thought of Hollywood as superior to our own film industry, and in many ways it is. But to compare two legendary performers with completely different types of films to their credit is to dumb down the craft far too much. Marilyn is Marilyn and Madhubala is Madhubala. They are two completely different individuals who carved their own distinct strongholds in cinema. It's time to recognize that fact and not insist on equating a Bollywood icon to a Hollywood personality. From what I can tell, it's very unclear which magazine or film journalist first ascribed the title of the Marilyn Monroe of Indian cinema to Madhubala, but the label certainly stuck. On reflection, while I think the distinction between Madhubala and Marilyn Monroe is certainly important, I feel like this topic needs a much more nuanced take, and that is what I want to discuss in this video. I feel like I'm in a really great position in this video because I'm a fan of both Madhubala and Marilyn Monroe. I've watched their work, documentaries, and listen to podcasts on them, and I think it would be necessary and kind of interesting to unpack the many similarities and differences between them. What they both have in common is that there's this kind of feminist thought that I have regarding both of them, this kind of what if when I look back on both these women. What if they were born during feminist movements or after feminist movements where they could be more independent and get the help that they needed during their lives? Madhubala and Marilyn Monroe are truly cultural icons to their audiences. They worked around the same time. They wanted to be taken seriously in their craft. They were very, very beautiful, and they kind of had a similar style on screen. They were able to enchant their audiences on screen. We can say that for many actresses of the past and since then. Yet other actresses do not continue to have such an immense pop culture relevance, like Marilyn Monroe in the West and Madhubala for the East. Madhubala rose to fame at a very significant time as well after Indian independence, and this kind of coincided with the rise of Indian cinema to a global level. Both suffered in their personal lives, had difficulties in love and unsuccessful marriages, and it's kind of eerie to note that both Madhubala and Marilyn Monroe tragically died in the 1960s at the age of 36. Their early deaths only add to the legend and the myth of both these women. It's been decades since these actresses died, and yet we still continue to talk about them and reference them to what is this hold that they have on us? What is this connection that they have to each other in terms of their films, their public persona, their life, and their death? I want to unpack it all in this video, so let's get into it. 2018, the New York Times published a new feature called Overlooked, in which they set out obituaries for remarkable people who left an important legacy in the history of the world, but were nonetheless overlooked at the time of their deaths by the New York Times. Since 1951, the New York Times published thousands of obituaries, but historically the selection was overwhelmingly chronicling the lives of men, and mostly white men. So in an effort to reset and address this, the Overlooked feature was created. Madhubala was featured in this ongoing effort, and the title of her obituary was as follows: Madhubala, a Bollywood legend whose life tragically mirrored Marilyn Monroe. Because there's so much material out there on Marilyn Monroe, including books, documentaries, interviews, and films, I will focus predominantly on Madhubala. This video is going to be in two parts. This is part one, where I focus on Madhubala's life as a child actor and her cultural icon status. Throughout, I will make references to Marilyn Monroe and her life in order to explore this title of Madhubala being the Marilyn Monroe of India, and where they converge and where they diverge. I think that what many people forget as well is that Madhubala actually stopped acting at the tender age of 27 due to her failing health. Her entire career happened from the age of 8 throughout her teens and in her 20s. She was like this shooting star who shone so brightly on screens for a very short period of time and then suddenly disappeared from screens. Interestingly, if you look at Marilyn Monroe's career and stardom, she was at the height of her career only for about a decade before her untimely death as well. Researching for this video, I read the book I Want to Live, The Story of Madhubala by Khatija Akbar. This book is probably the best biography to exist on Madhubala. The writer interviewed Madhubala's colleagues and tried to piece together the real life of a woman who, except for her movies, the general public knew very little about. I would recommend that you get a copy. It is a fascinating book with excellent research and insights into this time period and Madhubala's life. The writer even interviewed the Indian film actor Dilip Kumar for this book. Dilip Kumar and Madhubala's romance was a significant part of her life, although it ended in much heartbreak for her. In a crucial passage at the start of the book, the writer set out that in her research, it was not easy to come to terms with the reality of Madhubala's increasing suffering and helplessness. The beauty, adoration, and fame of Madhubala had come with a heavy price attached. Fate was not kind to Madhubala. She deserved better. There are very few interviews out there done by Madhubala in print. I don't think there's one on film. Many source materials have been destroyed since the 40s and 50s, and as a result, there's gaps of information missing about her in the 1950s and especially during the 1960s when she stopped acting for a few years as a result of her health concerns, as the writer of the book set out. It was fairly easy then to see Madhubala's films, but what was next to impossible was to get to know something of Madhubala the person, with contemporary film magazines barely mentioning her, and those of the 50s having all but vanished. There were no ready answers to questions of who, when, where, what, and why concerning Madhubala in the 60s. When she died, it was her obituary in the papers, in fact, that reported that she had a heart problem that she had suffered from for a while and died from as a result, and that she had been married to the Indian actor and singer Kishore Kumar, and that she left behind a family of parents and 5 sisters. Most of the people who really knew Madhubala on a personal level, and of those there are few, have died or are unwilling to publicly talk about her. This book tries mostly to fill in those gaps. It's a must read and so important in documenting Madhubala's life in some way. Perfect place to start, and something that is glaringly similar about Madhubala and Marilyn Monroe is that their names were not Madhubala and Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe was born Norma Jean Mortensen. She was baptized as Norma Jean Baker using her mother's surname. After signing her first contract with Fox Studios, she and Fox executive Ben Lyons started looking for a stage name for her. Lyons suggested Marilyn as her first name, as she reminded him of the Broadway star Marilyn Miller, while she suggested Monroe as her new last name, as that was her mother's maiden name. Madhubala has a somewhat similar story. She was born Begum Mumtaz Jahan Dilavi. For a while, as a child actor, Madhubala went by the name Baby Mumtaz. In her first starring film in 1947, Neil Kamal with Raj Kapoor, Madhubala was billed by her name, Mumtaz. But by 1948, her name was changed to Madhubala, and details around this change were set out in the book, stating the co-founder of the studio where she worked as a child, Bombay Talkies, suggested the name Madhubala for her. Co-founder of the studio was the Indian actress and producer Devika Rani. Bombay Talkies Studios and Devika Rani launched Madhubala and her career. Madhubala was born on Valentine's Day in 1933 in Delhi, British India. He was only 7 years younger than Marilyn Monroe. For Marilyn, her father was totally absent from her life, and her mother suffered from her own mental disorders, resulting in Marilyn being in and out of 12 foster homes and an orphanage growing up. She later married at 16. She started modeling after her marriage, which then led to her being discovered. What is very clear is that both Marilyn and Madhubala were pushed into adulthood too early in their lives. Madhubala had a very different childhood, with her own set of challenges. Grew up in an extremely strict and conservative household with both parents, but her family was impoverished, and at some point in her childhood, Madhubala became the primary source of income for her family as a child actress. She started working around the age of 8. As a child, she acted in films like Basant, and Madhubala was managed throughout her entire life during her career by her father, Atullah Khan. Like most child stars, this dynamic of the overprotective parent, being her father in this instance, and the obedient child star and being the daughter in this instance existed throughout Madhubala's life, at times to her detriment, especially later in her life when this dynamic clashed with her romance with Indian actor Dilip Kumar. Madhubala was both mature beyond her years when it came to her work ethic and acting, but was still controlled by her father in most aspects of her life. It's also important to note that actresses like Madhubala and Meena Kumari had no formal education in any school. This obviously affected their ability to claim their independence as adults. Madhubala spoke Hindi and Urdu and Pashto at home. However, at the age of 17, she decided to learn English and got herself a tutor. Her tutor, S.R. Patel, said of her student, "She picked it up very quickly. She could read English within 3 months. She was really remarkable." Madhubala led an extremely protected life. Her father chose her projects for her and managed her life and her work. According to the book, she did not attend any industry events. Her father managed her money, and the household was run entirely on her earnings. She started her day at 6 a.m. every morning, then leaving for work. She left the studio at 6 p.m. sharp every night. Night shootings were very rare, and only for the film Mughal-e-Azam were exceptions rarely made. Outdoor shooting was avoided as far as possible and limited to spots near Bombay, as set out in the book. A man of principles but notoriously uncompromising, egocentric and difficult, he, Madhubala's father, brought up his 6 daughters in a conservative environment with strict rules and regulations. Within the family, she, Madhubala, continued to be an obedient daughter. And Atullah Khan had transferred his responsibilities onto the small shoulders of his daughter. But at the same time, and in his own way, he had looked after her, ensured her well-being, and instilled in her a sense of discipline. So it's pretty clear from the book that Madhubala was very obedient by nature. Overprotected and dominated from an early age, and by nature unassertive, it was impossible for her to rebel in any way. Both these women had in common was that they were extremely beautiful. Their beauty was certainly celebrated and written about in film reviews, but unlike Marilyn, who unfairly faced a continuous barrage of critics questioning her talent because of her beauty, Madhubala was lauded for both her beauty and her talent from very early in her career. For instance, at the age of 15, Madhubala acted in the 1948 film Lal Dupatta, and a magazine of the time called Film India said this of her. Under K.B. Lal's competent direction, Madhubala acquires a new screen personality. She plays Shobha beautifully and proves herself at once competent. Her dialogue is also emotionally delivered. Lal Dupatta is an attractive picture, and the little Madhubala is its main attraction. This picture is the first milestone of her maturity in screen acting. At the age of 16, she acted in the 1949 film Singar, and a reviewer observed that Madhubala stores more emotions in a single face than would 1,000 girls with as many faces. Could be said that Madhubala acted in more films than she should have, but she was the sole breadwinner of her family, and like many child actors who had this role in real life, the decision to take on many projects may not even have been completely in her control. Stone film for Madhubala's success was the 1949 film Mahal. This film is considered to be the very first Bollywood horror film. It was directed by Kamal Amruhi, and Mahal was produced by Bombay Talkies Studio on a modest budget, and it was one of the biggest hits of that decade. The film really launched Madhubala and the Nightingale of India, Lata Mangeshkar, into superstardom. The film deals with reincarnation and ghosts and unfulfilled love. It was something that the Indian audience hadn't seen before. Producer and lead actor of Mahal, Ashok Kumar, reportedly said about Madhubala in the film, "When we were casting for Mahal, I know we needed a very beautiful and ethereal girl who could convincingly play the spirit. Madhubala was about 15 or 16 then, and I was more than double her age. So I might have hesitated casting her opposite me if it had been a conventional love story, but in this case, I thought we wouldn't look miscast. She made a very beautiful spirit, but as an artist, she was very raw and required many retakes." So this was a very interesting statement for him to make, because it was Madhubala who really carried this film. time, and in some reviews for Mahal at the time, she was described as the film's real hit and rated much higher than the senior actor. It remained Madhubala's highest grossing release for the next 6 years until she did a movie called Mr. and Mrs. 55. By the late 1950s, Madhubala was a nationwide success. For both Madhubala and Marilyn Monroe, there are reports that they had an ability when in front of the camera to completely capture the audience with their charm. Madhubala had a trademark crooked smile with a sense of mischievousness surrounding her. Both actresses also had excellent comedic timing in their films. Dance was a major part of Hindi films during this time, and despite her precarious health status, Madhubala approached a dancer, Sitara Devi, to improve and coach her in dance. She was surprised by this request from this beautiful actress, saying that she was so beautiful as an actress that she didn't need to learn dance. But Madhubala was determined to add to her credibility as an artist. Marilyn had columnists and reporters in Hollywood focus on her beauty, but more so on her sexuality. This sex icon image was something that she tried desperately to move away from as she matured and wanted to be taken more seriously as an actress. Reports surrounding Madhubala's beauty and on-screen presence were vastly different. There was less a focus on her sexuality, but rather on her ethereal, otherworldly beauty. These are just some of the reviews on her written by columnists at the time. The artist brings to the screen a beauty never before seen, gifted with rare beauty and captivating grace. Any camera which did not caress that face would be guilty of a crime. Easily our Indian cinema's most versatile and best-looking artist. Interestingly, in one of her very rare statements to the press, Madhubala once stated that, "To be beautiful means a lot to me, but not everything. Happiness comes first." As Khatija Akbar set out in her book, the only parallel to the celebration of Madhubala's beauty and image would perhaps be found in how Marilyn Monroe was described in the press. In the book, her colleagues remarked on how beautiful Madhubala was. The photographer J.H. Tucker spoke about her from a photographer's point of view. You could photograph her from any angle without makeup and still come away with a masterpiece. She was a cameraman's delight. Interestingly, there were similar statements made about Marilyn Monroe by photographers during her career. When Marilyn Monroe did her first screen test, the cinematographer Leon Shamroy said that when he got the film back, he was stunned. Even that early, there was something about this woman that was invisible to the naked eye that a camera could capture. Why was it that the beauty of Marilyn Monroe and her roles was played up more as a sex symbol in the West, who played into men's fantasies, whereas Madhubala was considered more of a timeless beauty? Why is it that Marilyn Monroe was playing up this blonde bombshell's icon status, whereas Madhubala was playing an array of vastly different kinds of roles? To answer this question, there is a lot that lies with the sensibilities and the tastes of the audience of the East and the West. It's clear that the taste and response of the Hollywood audience versus the Indian audience was extremely different during these years, being the 1950s. Perception of Madhubala as the Venus of Indian cinema had a lot to do with the more conservative Indian audience at the time of her fame, and the so-called values that were required to be a good woman in cinema as a leading lady, representing the mores of society. In the West, Marilyn Monroe's rise to fame happened when she was perceived as a sex symbol, a woman who enjoyed her sexuality just as much as a man. For Madhubala, that was not really an image at the time the mainstream Indian audience would accept for their leading heroine. Predominantly at that time, women whose actions were compelled by their own sexuality were usually cast as like the vamp of the film. Ultimately, these image sensibilities of the audience deeply impacted the roles that both Madhubala and Marilyn Monroe went on to play and were offered, as set out in an academic article on the topic. According to the social climate and cultural values of the time, heroines' appearances evolved. The Indian audience preferred coy, wholesome heroines in the 1950s and 1960s, draped in Indian traditional outfits. The audience didn't want to see their bare bodies. The new generation's perspective, however, altered after the 1970s as time went on, and India grew closer to the West as a result of globalization. Now they are drawn to Hollywood films via VCRs, video, satellite channels, mobile phones, the internet, and social media. Bollywood movies adapt based on public preferences in order to compete with the competition and draw audiences to the theatre. The personality trait that Madhubala had was her dedication to her work. She was always on time for shoots. Discipline and her professionalism were legendary in the industry. There's this famous story contained in the book about torrential rains happening in Bombay, and everything was closed because of the weather. But Madhubala made her way to the studio for shooting. There was nobody at the studio on this day because of the weather. Everyone just accepted that nobody would be working. The only person that was there was the watchman, and he was shocked when he saw the lead actress Madhubala ready for shooting on this day. And it's like a legendary story about her seriousness regarding her work. In the book, the writer set out that this attitude to her work inevitably influenced her personal life as well. She would abide by a certain set of rules and regulations in both her work and her personal life, at times even at the cost of her own self. In the unlikely environment of a laid-back film industry, one actress was going to follow her time schedule with precise clockwork and punctuality. So this kind of reminded me a little bit. I listened to the audiobook for Britney Spears' book a couple of months back, and in the book she talks about how as a child performer you really become a people pleaser. There's this need to please everybody, to make sure the work is done no matter what. People relying on you as a kid, and you have to get your work done. And these stories about Madhubala kind of reminded me of that approach that Britney Spears explained in her memoir regarding the mindset and the attitude of a child artist and performer. In this way, Madhubala was very different from Marilyn Monroe, whose ongoing personal struggles greatly affected her ability to perform on the day of shooting, as set out in the New York Times article for Overlooked. Starting in the late 1940s, in a newly independent India finding its place in the world, Madhubala often portrayed modern young women testing the limits of tradition. Her roles embodied the optimism of a new generation, which was rather consciously moving away from its colonial past. Madhubala's dedication to really perfecting her work in a film extended to the sets of Mughal-e-Azam, and this film took, I think, 10 years to complete in total. It took the most physically and mentally and emotionally out of the actress, as set out in the book. Looking at Madhubala on screen, it was impossible to believe that she had a recurrent heart problem, plagued her on and off throughout her career. There was no limit to the strain her heart could take, yet there were no attempts to control the pace of her work. Dilip Kumar sat down for an interview in this book, and he commented on her work ethic and her health as well, stating, "No proper advice was given, nor was a practical, workable course of life drawn for her. At the same time, she herself had an obsession for her work." When you read the book, you'll see that most of Madhubala's contemporaries and her colleagues spoke very highly of her. It had to be noted that her opportunities for forming close friendships were very few. She followed a strict schedule by her father, and even then, despite her success and breadth of work, her acting skills kind of went underappreciated. She never won any awards during her lifetime for any of her films, despite many being a huge success. What's pretty clear from all the documentaries and podcasts and films on them is that Madhubala and Marilyn were extremely different in their approaches to stardom. Marilyn Monroe was more comfortable in creating her public persona. She gave her fans what they wanted by putting on the famous Marilyn persona for them at events. Marilyn had fashioned her look to that of another famous Hollywood blonde, the legendary Jean Harlow. And Marilyn Monroe grew up watching Jean Harlow films, and she was a major fan of her work. Madhubala, however, was completely different. She avoided the public. She was very anxious in crowds. And it was very seldom that her fans actually got to see her in public. Her elusiveness only added to her allure and her mystique, as set out in the book. But a mob of faces staring at her, calling out to her and rushing to get her autograph threw her into a panic. She had a real fear of crowds. She never went anywhere apart from the studios. She didn't interact with journalists like other stars of her time. By the age of 20, Madhubala had attained a lot of wealth as an actress, but her approach to life was very simple. She did not really wear makeup. Her wardrobe was fairly ordinary. Madhubala reportedly said about her fairly ordinary, simple lifestyle that, "I am not a spendthrift for the simple reason that I do not know what to spend money on. I do not have a passion for jewelry or clothes. I do not travel. I do not go out much. By God's grace, I have all the necessities of life and I'm happy. Love my work and films are my life. Is it surprising then that I spend most of my money on my films?" I think it's also important to remember that Marilyn's image as a sex symbol or as the blonde bombshell was created and fueled by the roles that she played, the press, and at times Marilyn herself. Madhubala's image was very different and really less about her sexuality and more about her beauty, timelessness, and mischievousness. Reports and images of Madhubala and her films soon traveled beyond the Indian subcontinent. In a New York magazine called Theatre Art, published from 1916 to 1964, Madhubala was profiled. The title of the article for Madhubala was "The Biggest Star in the World and She's Not in Beverly Hills." An excerpt from the 1952 article set out that the actress with the greatest following in numbers and devotion is not to be found in Hollywood but on the opposite side of the planet, in Bombay, India. Her name is Madhubala. She is 19 years old, a small girl with arching eyebrows and a shy, sweet smile, who has risen to the top of the Indian movie industry in the last 2 years. Madhubala's local audience is taken from the people of India and Pakistan, whose population was at the time about the population of the United States and all Western Europe combined. Her pictures also have a lively export market in Burma, Indonesia, and East Africa. American ignorance of Madhubala is understandable. One thing, the righteous movie boom in India dates only from around 1943. For another, Madhubala's ascendancy is only 2 years old, and she herself is a new phenomenon in the Eastern world. The story of India for the last 10 years may be condensed as the war, the movie boom, independence, and Madhubala. A year before this article, in 1951, Madhubala did a photo shoot with the photographer and photojournalist James Burke for Life magazine, American magazine published weekly from 1883 to 1972. These candid shots present a surprisingly intimate portrait of Madhubala at the time, as the photoshoot was done in her own home. These images really presented her in a very unguarded manner. She looked happy, she looked totally at ease. At the time of the photoshoot, Madhubala was just 18 years old. Not only did Life magazine have a connection to Madhubala, but it also had a significant connection to Marilyn Monroe. Her debut cover with Life magazine happened in April 1952, just a year after the Madhubala feature. 1953, Marilyn Monroe did a photo shoot with Life magazine that reminded me of the Madhubala shoot in a few ways. These images were shot at Marilyn Monroe's home at the time. They also presented very intimate portraits of her in her own space. There were rumblings of the news of Madhubala in the West. 1952, the American filmmaker Frank Capra Jr. visited Bombay for the film festival, and he specifically wanted to meet Madhubala for a possible Hollywood film debut. The fascination surrounding the life and death of Marilyn Monroe continues to this day. Despite the many other Hollywood blondes before her and after her, Marilyn Monroe's life, death, and images continue to be used in pop culture. In an excellent video essay by Mina Lee that I watched a while back, talked about why we see so many Marilyn Monroe images and photographs plastered on so many products. Basically, she explains that after her death, Marilyn Monroe, in her will, gave her acting coach 75% of her intellectual property rights and 25% to her therapist. Her acting coach passed away. His share went to his second wife, who never even met Marilyn. Afterwards, his second wife signed deals for Marilyn's face to be plastered all over, and she eventually sold her stake for a very hefty amount. This results in this long-standing fascination for her. We see her everywhere, endorsing products even in her death. The video is called "Let's Discuss the Obsession with Marilyn Monroe." I will put the link to the video in the description box. The fascination surrounding Madhubala also continued after her death. In 2008, the Indian Post and Telegraph Department chose to commemorate the memory of Madhubala with a postal stamp. In 2010, she was honored further when her image was included in Pride of India collection. In 2017, the Bollywood actress Sonam Kapoor referenced Anarkali in a photoshoot for Filmfare magazine. Directors like Sanjay Leela Bhansali continue to reference Mughal-e-Azam as inspirations for his period films. Mumbai even had a mural dedicated to Mughal-e-Azam and Madhubala's Anarkali character. The name of the popular Anarkali outfit itself is tied to the fact that the character in Mughal-e-Azam wore these kinds of outfits in the film, and the film is credited with really reviving the myth of Anarkali and this kind of silhouette that is named after her. The fascination surrounding Madhubala after her death is because of a few elements. Yes, she was a beautiful and amazing actress, but it is her role in Mughal-e-Azam that kind of advances this legend and myth of Madhubala herself. Ultimately, what keeps the mystique, the mystery, and the myth of Madhubala alive is her role as Anarkali in Mughal-e-Azam. Mughal-e-Azam will always be considered as one of the most important films in Indian film history. It was unlike any other film when it was being made. It's a cinematic masterpiece to this day. It was released in 1960 and it took around a decade to make. Gained a new generation of fans in 2004 when it became the first black and white Hindi film to be digitally colorized. It was the most expensive film of its era and the grandest film of its time. Madhubala played Anarkali, a tragic figure who as a courtesan falls in love with Prince Salim, played by Dilip Kumar. The nature of the role played by Madhubala is a mixture itself of ethereal beauty, tragedy, and grandeur. It is perhaps because of this iconic role that Madhubala will forever be a part of popular culture. This is the role that she is the most remembered for. In 2017, the Madame Tussauds in Delhi added a wax figure of Madhubala based on, of course, the iconic character of Anarkali. Her sister posed with the figure when it was unveiled. In 2019, on what would have been her 86th birthday, Google honored Madhubala with a doodle. That means the search engine would be Madhubala themed in some way. And of course, the doodle was of Madhubala again in her iconic role as Anarkali. So this was part 1 of the Madhubala series. There's a lot more to say on Madhubala's love life and her health concerns and her death, as well as discuss some of the most famous films. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. See you guys in part 2.